sometime in the late 1870s, tucked against the hills of western Massachusetts. A small mill town was the setting for an unusual discovery. A gravedigger named Elias Croft was opening the earth beside the oldest church in Havelock County when his shovel struck wood. Not the soft, weather-eaten planks of a forgotten coffin, but something harder, deliberately sealed, and far too large to be a casket. What he found beneath the foundation of that church, a building that had stood at the community's center for nearly 150 years, was not a crypt, not a collapsed cellar, not a storage passage for communion wine or winter grain. It was a staircase. God damn it. 12 steps of hand, cut granite descending into a chamber that smelled of tallow, old leather, and something else entirely. Something the gravedigger would later describe, when he still had the composure to speak of it at all, as the smell of fear made permanent. Within 3 days of that discovery, the church deacon had filed papers sealing the site. Within a week, the county records office reported that 2 decades of congregation registers had gone missing. And within a month, Elias Croft had left Havelock County without collecting his final wages, without saying goodbye to his wife's sister with whom he boarded, and without ever writing home. Before we continue with the story of Havelock and the hidden staircase beneath St. Aldric's church, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment below telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know how far this darkness travels. That discovery in 1878 did not come out of nowhere. The ground beneath St. Aldric's had been keeping it secret for a very long time, and the town of Havelock had perhaps been keeping it too. Havelock was the kind of town that appeared in county atlases with its name printed in letters, just slightly too confident for its size. It had never been large, perhaps 800 souls at its peak. Settled in the 1730s by a congregation of dissenters from a Boston area church who had walked inland until they found a river bend they liked and decided God had placed it there for them specifically. They built a mill first, then a meeting house, then houses, then a proper church. The church came last, consecrated in 1741 and named for an obscure Anglo-Saxon martyr that no one in the congregation could actually trace to any canonical record, a detail that the founding pastor, a Reverend Obadiah Fenwick, deflected whenever it was raised with a vague reference to a devotional pamphlet he claimed to have read in his youth. By the time of the Civil War, Havelock had settled into the comfortable, middling stagnation of a town that had survived its founding hardships and now simply persisted. The mill processed wool from local farms. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a small schoolhouse, a tavern that was technically a temperance establishment but served cider strong enough to flatten a mule. These were the institutions of daily life. The church, St. Aldric's, occupied the highest point of the main road, set back from the street on a modest rise. Its white clapboard siding was repainted every decade by volunteers whose piety and their desire to be seen being pious were roughly indistinguishable. The congregation was Congregationalist in denomination and New England in temperament, which is to say deeply uncomfortable with emotional display, intermittently suspicious of outsiders, and absolutely committed to the public performance of moral rectitude, regardless of what occurred in private. The pastor in 1878, when Elias Croft shovel-struck granite, was a man named Reverend Silas Drummond, 53 years old, a widower, a temperance advocate, and the third consecutive member of his family to hold the position. His grandfather had been called to the pulpit here in 1799. His father had served until his death in 1851, and Silas had assumed the role without anyone formally offering it to him. He had simply begun delivering sermons, and the congregation had found it easier to accept than to object. He was not a warm man. He was not a cruel man, either, at least not in any way that was visible. He was the sort of person who answered every question with a longer question, who remembered exactly what you had said to him years earlier and held it with perfect patience, until the moment it became useful, and who smiled in a way that never quite reached his eyes, but was technically a smile and therefore beyond criticism. Elias Croft, the gravedigger, was in most ways Drummond's opposite. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and had come to Havelock from upstate New York, after a dispute with a former employer, the precise nature of which he declined to specify, but which had apparently involved a disputed payment and a great deal of shouting in a public street. He had been in town for 4 years, was considered reliable if not sociable, and was one of the few residents of Havelock who had never once set foot inside St. Aldric's church. This last fact was noted occasionally by certain members of the congregation. Elias did not appear to notice them noticing. The grave he was digging that October afternoon in 1878 was for a woman named Prudence Holcomb, age 78, the widow of a former selectman, who had died peacefully and was to be interred in the north plot of the churchyard in the section reserved for long-time families. The north plot was the oldest section, and the soil there was full of the usual difficulties: roots, stones, the occasional fragment of older burial material from the colonial era when record-keeping was imprecise and placement was approximate. Elias was accustomed to such obstacles. What he was not accustomed to was the sound his shovel made at approximately 4 feet down. Not the crack of striking stone, but a kind of hollow resonance, as though whatever he had hit was covering something beneath it, rather than simply existing in the earth. He crouched, cleared the soil by hand, and found a fitted granite slab approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet across, sealed at its edges with what appeared to be lead. Carefully poured lead, the kind of work that required a craftsman, not a laborer. In one corner of the slab was a shallow depression worn smooth that might once have accommodated a ring or handle now long since removed. Elias stood up. He looked at the church. He looked at the slab. He went to find the deacon. The deacon of St. Aldric's in 1878 was a man named Cornelius Vane, a dry goods merchant of 60 years who had held the position for the past 11, and took considerable satisfaction in the administrative aspects of church governance, while leaving the spiritual dimensions almost entirely to Reverend Drummond. Vane was the sort of man who kept meticulous ledgers and trusted them more than he trusted people. When Elias came to find him at the store, Vane listened to the description of the slab with the expression of a man who has been handed a document he does not wish to sign. He came to look. He bent over the exposed granite, ran his thumb along the lead seal, and straightened up with a controlled deliberateness that Elias would later describe as the movement of a man deciding something, rather than discovering something. Vane told Elias to cover the area with a tarpaulin and say nothing until Reverend Drummond could be consulted. He did not say why. He did not seem surprised. Drummond came the following morning. He stood at the edge of the opened area for a long time without speaking. The day was cold and overcast, the kind of October morning that seems designed to suggest endings. The leaves mostly gone. The sky the color of old pewter. The churchyard smelling of damp earth, and the particular cold of a season turning its back. When Drummond finally spoke, he said only that the matter would require careful consideration, and that Mrs. Holcomb's interment would need to be relocated to the east plot. He did not touch the slab. He did not crouch to examine it as Vane had done. He simply looked at it. And Elias had the distinct impression, though he was not a man given to impressions, that Drummond had known it was there, What happened next over the following 24 hours is partially documented and partially inferred from testimony given later in another context under circumstances that themselves require explanation. What is established? Drummond sent a letter that day on church stationery, addressed to a recipient, whose name was later redacted from the copy, retained in the county clerk's office, the retention of which copy was itself apparently accidental. The letter requested an urgent meeting regarding a matter of congregational stewardship. Drummond also visited the county records office personally that afternoon, a visit logged in the office's visitor register, and spent approximately 2 hours in the archive room. The clerk on duty, a young man named Thomas Greer, noted afterward that Drummond had seemed agitated, which was unusual enough that Greer mentioned it to his mother at supper. His mother mentioned it to a neighbor, and in this way, the observation entered the gossip stream of Havelock, without Drummond ever knowing it had been witnessed. On the third day, Vane filed the papers sealing the site. The official description cited structural instability beneath the north plot and ordered that no further excavation occur pending a professional assessment. No professional was ever identified in subsequent documentation. No assessment was ever filed. The north plot was quietly closed to new interments and within 6 months had been bordered with a low decorative fence that made it look like a deliberate memorial garden rather than a prohibition. Elias Croft learned of the filing from a clerk at the town hall who assumed he already knew. He did not. He returned to the churchyard that evening alone after dark with a lantern and a pry bar. This was unambiguously trespassing, and he was aware of it. He proceeded anyway, which tells you something about what a man will do when his professional curiosity and his intuitive discomfort with a lie collide in the same place. He cleared the slab again, removed the tarpaulin, and examined the lead seal more carefully than he had done the first time. It was old work. He couldn't date it precisely, but the oxidation pattern was consistent with something that had been in the ground for a very long time. Not weeks or years, but decades at minimum, possibly much longer. The seal was continuous, unbroken. Whoever had last opened this passage, if it was a passage, had resealed it completely. He worked the pry bar along one edge for the better part of an hour before the lead gave. Not breaking, but separating from the stone in a single piece, as though it had been poured as a gasket and simply needed to be lifted. Beneath the slab in the lantern light were the 12 granite steps descending into darkness. The air that rose from them was cold, colder than the surrounding earth, which should not have been possible, and carried that smell Elias would later fail to adequately describe to anyone. Not rot, not standing water, not the mineral smell of deep stone. Something older and more personal than any of those, as though the space below had once been full of human breath and fear, and had retained the memory of it after the people were gone. He went down. He counted the steps as he went. He would tell exactly one person what he found at the bottom, and that person would tell exactly one other person. And the chain of transmission is fragmentary enough that what we have is partial, interpreted, and filtered through people who were themselves frightened by what they were repeating. But certain elements are consistent across every version. The chamber was roughly rectangular, perhaps 20 feet by 15, with walls of fitted fieldstone that appeared to predate the church's construction. The ceiling was low enough that Elias, at 6 feet, had to angle his head slightly. There were no windows, no other exits that he could find, and no obvious ventilation, which raised the question of how the air remained breathable after what must have been decades of sealing. A question he did not have an answer for, and that would trouble him later. There were objects in the chamber. Not furniture, not provisions, not the kind of thing you would store in a root cellar. Shelving along two walls, hand-built, holding a collection of items that Elias catalogued mentally with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has worked around death long enough to have learned how not to panic in its presence. Bound ledgers, perhaps 40 or 50 of them, in varying states of preservation. A large wooden chest with a brass lock, too heavy to move without tools. Several wrapped bundles he did not unwrap. And on a low shelf near the foot of the stairs, a single candlestick of pewter, its base encrusted with the residue of many candles, burned down to nothing over a long period of time. The wax layers accumulated like geological strata, preserving in their depth the impression of many different fingers. Someone had been coming here, not once, many times, over many years. And the most disturbing element, the one that Elias reportedly returned to whenever he spoke of it, was not anything he found in the chamber itself. It was something he noticed on the underside of the granite slab as he prepared to climb back out. Carved into the stone, crudely, with something sharp, in letters no more than an inch high, were two words in what appeared to be Latin, Nimosiat. Let no one know. In the weeks that followed Elias Croft's disappearance from Havelock, he was gone by early November, his room cleared, his wages uncollected. A brief note left with his landlady that said only that he had found employment elsewhere. The community's relationship to St. Aldric's church underwent a subtle but pervasive shift. Nothing was said openly. In Havelock, as in most New England towns of its era, the socially acceptable range of public discourse was narrow, and the consequences of exceeding it were real, if informal. You did not accuse a reverend. You did not challenge a deacon's administrative decision. You certainly did not repeat the word of a laborer who had vanished in ambiguous circumstances over a matter that the legitimate authorities had seen fit to close. But things were said in the dry goods store, in the tavern, or at the schoolhouse gate when mothers were waiting. The gossip had a quality that distinguished it from ordinary rumor. It was quieter than it should have been, and it traveled in shorter chains, as if people were instinctively limiting who they told. Thomas Greer, the records office clerk, mentioned to a cousin that Reverend Drummond had seemed less like a man surprised by a discovery than like a man managing a crisis he had anticipated. An older woman named Harriet Selcombe, who had lived in Havelock her entire 72 years, and whose memory for local history was more reliable than the county archive, told her daughter that there had been whispers about St. Aldric's foundations before. Decades earlier, when the church had been partially refloored in the 1840s, and that a workman involved in that project had reportedly refused to speak about what he had seen during the renovation and had thereafter attended services at a Methodist church in the next town until his death. The 1840s renovation was documented in the church records, or rather it had been, by December of 1878, when a local historian named Edmund Lacey attempted to examine those records for a county history project he was compiling. He found that the congregation registers for the years 1856 through 1872 were missing from the church archive, and that the renovation records he sought had apparently been filed in a different portion of the archive that was currently under reorganization and could not be accessed at present. Reverend Drummond offered this explanation with every appearance of helpfulness, and Edmund Lacey wrote it down. The County History Project eventually produced a volume published in 1882 that covered Havelock's church in 4 pages of vague praise and said nothing about any of this. What Harriet Selcombe's daughter, a woman named Margaret Yarrow, did over the winter of 1878 and into 1879 was more methodical than gossip. Margaret was 38 years old, unmarried, educated at a female seminary in Northampton, and employed as the school teacher at Havelock's one-room school. She had the analytical habits of a person who had spent years teaching children to reason from evidence rather than assumption, and she applied those habits now with a patience and discretion that were necessary given the social environment she was operating in. She did not confront anyone. She did not file complaints. She began, very quietly, to write letters. She wrote to the Congregationalist Regional Conference inquiring about the history of St. Aldric's founding congregation and whether records from the church's earliest years were retained centrally. She received a polite reply indicating that records prior to 1780 were inconsistent, and that what the conference held for Havelock was minimal. She wrote to the Massachusetts Historical Society asking about settlement patterns in the Western Hill Country during the 1730s and whether the group that had founded Havelock had any documented history prior to their arrival. This reply was more interesting. The society held correspondence from the 1730s that referenced a group of dissenters from a Boston congregation who had departed the city following a dispute with their former church community, the nature of which was not clearly documented, but appeared to involve a question of property held in common and the terms of its disposition. The founding pastor, Obadiah Fenwick, was mentioned by name. His role in the dispute was not specified, but the tone of the surviving correspondence was distinctly unfriendly to him. Margaret wrote to the archives of the Boston congregation. She received no reply for 11 weeks. When the reply finally came, it was brief. A single paragraph from an archivist who explained that records from the period in question were fragmentary, and that the information she sought was not available. But at the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly different from the main text, as if added as an afterthought by a different person, was a line that Margaret kept and reread many times. Inquiries regarding this period of the congregation's history have been received before. We regret that our response must be the same. Someone else had been asking the same questions. Margaret did not know who. She began to wonder if they had found answers and what had happened to them afterward. In the spring of 1879, a stranger arrived in Havelock. This was not in itself remarkable. The town received travelers from time to time, salesmen and surveyors, and the occasional tourist whose interest in New England scenery had carried them off the main roads. What was somewhat unusual about this particular arrival was that he was not passing through. He took a room at the tavern for what he described as an extended stay and settled in with the deliberateness of a man who had come for a specific purpose and was prepared to take the time required to accomplish it. His name was Augustine Farrow, and he described himself as a journalist, which in 1879 covered a wide range of activities from genuine newspaper reporting to what we would now call private investigation. He was perhaps 50, with the careful eyes of a man who had learned to observe without appearing to observe. He carried a leather satchel that he did not set down in public, and a notebook that he filled with small clothes, written text in a hand that was almost impossible to read over his shoulder, as 2 or 3 curious Havelock residents discovered when they tried. He was pleasant, asked questions that seemed innocuous, and accepted evasive answers with a graciousness that did not mean he stopped asking. He had come, he told the tavern keeper, because he was writing a long piece about the founding of mill towns in western Massachusetts and was interested in the older settlement histories. He attended a Sunday service at St. Aldric's and sat in the back pew without a hymnal, watching the congregation more than the pulpit. He visited the records office. He spoke with Edmund Lacey about the county history project at length. taking careful notes and asking questions that Lacey described afterward as surprisingly astute for a man with no apparent background in local history. He walked the churchyard alone on a Tuesday afternoon and stood for a considerable time near the decorative fence that now bordered the north plot, doing nothing in particular that anyone could observe, but apparently doing something. Some private calculation, some measurement taken by eye. He bought rounds at the tavern. He was generous with his tobacco. He had a quality that certain people in certain professions develop over years, a kind of deliberate unthreateningness, an ability to sit in a room and make it seem as if his presence there were entirely accidental, which caused people to speak more freely in his vicinity than they might otherwise have done. He learned this way that Harlan Tibbet had not attended services for several weeks, and that this was considered strange. He learned that Reverend Drummond had recently taken on a second lock for the church sacristy door, which previously had not been locked at all. He learned that a young man who did odd jobs for the church had been relieved of those duties in November and given no explanation, and that this young man had mentioned to a friend that he had heard on one occasion when he was working late and had entered through the side entrance rather than the main door, what he described as the sound of heavy things being dragged across a stone floor from somewhere below him. Approximately 2 weeks after his arrival, through a chain of social introduction whose mechanics Margaret Yarrow could not fully reconstruct later, he appeared at her door one evening and asked if she might be willing to speak with him about local history. She was cautious. She was also, and this is important to understand, deeply relieved, because she had been seminarian for findings for 4 months in nearly complete isolation, with no one she trusted enough to share them with. The accumulation of that silence had begun to feel like a weight she was not sure she could continue carrying alone. She had been sleeping badly. She had found herself in the middle of lessons on grammar or arithmetic, drifting to the Latin phrase carved into the granite, Nemo Siat, and returning from it with a start, sometimes to find her students watching her with the alert concern of children who understand that the adult in front of them is not entirely present. She had started walking home from school by different routes for reasons she could not entirely articulate. She let Pharaoh in. They talked for 3 hours. She showed him the letter from Boston. He showed her something in return. What Pharaoh had was a document he had obtained through methods he declined to specify from the estate of a man named Jonathan Peel, who had died in 1871 in Hartford, Connecticut, and who had been, 40 years earlier, one of the workmen involved in the 1840s renovation of St. Aldric's floor. Peel had not, apparently, spent his post-Havelock years in total silence. He had written an account dated 1865, which he had sealed and left with his personal papers, with instructions that it not be opened until after his death. He was apparently confident that the passage of time would provide some protection to whatever he felt he was describing. It had taken another 6 years for the estate to be settled and the document to surface, and another 8 for it to reach someone who understood its significance. During those years, the document had passed through at least 3 pairs of hands, each of whom had read it, felt the particular chill of recognizing something that does not fit neatly into any existing category of experience, and then done nothing, not because they were cowardly, necessarily, but because doing something with a document like this required knowing what kind of something was possible. And none of them had known. The account was 9 pages long, written in an unsteady hand that suggested Peel had been either elderly or frightened, or both, when he composed it. It described what he had found during the 1840s renovation in some detail. The church's interior floor had been lifted to allow for new foundation work in the eastern end of the nave. And during this process, a section of the original floorboards had revealed beneath them a second layer of material. Not a simple subfloor, but a deliberate wooden platform built over a void. The workmen had been instructed to board over this void without examining it. Most of them had complied. Jonathan Peel had not. He had lowered himself by rope into the space below, while the foreman was occupied elsewhere, and had seen enough to convince him, at the age of roughly 30, to leave Havelock and never speak of it for 2 decades, and then to keep speaking of it only in a document he planned never to see published. What Peel described below the church floor in the 1840s corresponded closely enough to what Elias Croft had described in the churchyard in 1878 that both Margaret and Farrow recognized the connection immediately. The chamber, the shelves, the ledgers, the chest. But Peel's account contained something Croft's did not. Because Peel, either braver or more reckless than the gravedigger, had done something Croft had not. He had opened one of the ledgers. He described it in careful, horrified language, the language of a man trying to be precise about something that has disturbed him at the level of reflex. The ledger he opened appeared to be a register of transactions, names, dates, amounts. Some of the names were people he recognized as Havelock residents. People he had spoken with on the street. People who had greeted him by name when he arrived to begin work on the renovation. The ordinariness of the names was, in Peel's telling, the worst part. He had expected, if there were anything sinister in this place, for it to wear sinister clothing. He had not expected to see the names of men who nodded to him at the general store, men whose children attended the same Sunday school, where the doctrines of Christian charity were taught each week without apparent irony. Some of the amounts were larger than a laboring man's annual wage. The dates stretched back to the 1750s, within living memory of the church's founding, and the most recent entry he saw was dated 1838, 3 years before the renovation. The nature of the transactions, what was being exchanged for these sums, was not immediately clear from the ledger itself. The entries used abbreviated notations whose meaning Peel could only partially decipher. But one category of abbreviation appeared consistently enough, and in combination with certain other notations, that Peel believed, and recorded his belief, that what the ledger documented was not commerce in goods. It was commerce in people. He had held that ledger in his hands for perhaps 5 minutes before he heard the foreman returning. He put it back, climbed out of the space, and said nothing to anyone for 27 years. Margaret Yarrow set the document down. The fire in her small hearth had burned low without either of them noticing. Outside the schoolteacher's window, Havelock was dark and quiet, the spring night cool enough to see breath. The church steeple was visible against the sky 2 streets over, that familiar, white spire that she had looked at her entire life and had always understood as a symbol of something stable and decent. She thought of all the sermons she had heard delivered from the pulpit beneath that spire. She thought of the doctrine of bearing witness. She asked Farrow what he intended to do with what he had. He said he intended to find out how far back it went, and who had known. Farrow's method over the following weeks was systematic, and given what he was looking into, remarkably brave or remarkably imprudent. Possibly both. He mapped the people connected to St. Aldric's governance over the entire span of its existence, working backward from Drummond and Vane through the historical record, identifying the deacons and trustees and select committee members across 137 years of institutional life. It was slow, painstaking work, The kind of research that looks from the outside like a man reading old ledgers and newspapers in a back corner of a records office. Which is exactly what it was, but which involved a quality of attention and a willingness to follow implications wherever they led, which most people engaged in that kind of reading deliberately do not allow themselves. He referenced these names against property records at the county level, against the fragmentary tax records available for the colonial period, against the membership rolls of two fraternal organizations that had operated in Havelock during the antebellum years. Organizations whose membership overlapped almost perfectly with the church's governance structure. The names repeated across generations in a way that was not accidental. Certain families appeared on the church governance rolls decade after decade, rotating through the positions of deacon and trustee and committee chair with the clockwork regularity of an arrangement rather than an election. The Drummond family was the most obvious example, but not the only one. The Vane family had held the deaconate in one form or another since the 1780s. A family named Quelch, old New England stock, substantial landowners, appeared in the governance records in every decade from 1750 onward. What these families shared, beyond their church association, was property, significant land holdings that had been established rapidly in the 1740s and 1750s. More rapidly than could easily be explained by the modest agricultural returns of the western Massachusetts hill country in that period, and which had been maintained and expanded across the generations with a consistency that spoke of carefully preserved advantage, rather than ordinary inheritance. The pattern that emerged was not a secret society in the dramatic sense. No elaborate rituals. No cryptic symbols beyond the Latin carved into the stone. No theatrical apparatus of the kind that popular imagination associates with hidden organizations. It was something more mundane and therefore more chilling. A closed network of men across multiple generations who had used the institutional cover of the church to conduct business of a nature they could not conduct openly, and who had maintained that cover through careful selection of successors, deliberate suppression of documentation, and the particular social gravity of a religious institution in a small New England town where challenging the church meant challenging something very close to the community's self-definition. The chamber beneath the church, accessed, Pharaoh now believed, from 2 points, the sealed staircase in the churchyard and the void beneath the nave floor, had served as a repository for their records and at certain periods as a meeting space. The lead, sealed slab had been resealed at least twice based on the stratification of the seal material, which suggested deliberate periodic access and reclosing. The most recent resealing appeared to date from the early 1860s, the Civil War years, when the question of what had been recorded in those ledgers would have become, for the men who held that knowledge, a matter of existential urgency, because the war had changed the calculus entirely. What had been in 1750 or 1780 or even 1830 a matter of commercial record, documented, archived, accessible to those with keys, had become by 1861 something that could not be safely acknowledged to exist. The political and legal landscape had shifted beneath the feet of the men who held this secret, and the ledgers in the chamber, which had once been an organizational necessity, had become a liability of potentially catastrophic proportions. Pharaoh believed that the resealing of the chamber in the early 1860s represented a decision made by the governance network to freeze the archive, to stop adding to it, stop using it as an active repository, and hope that the sealed stone and the overgrown ivy and the institutional authority of the church above it would be sufficient protection until the world changed enough to make the contents irrelevant. What they had not adequately planned for was Elias Croft's shovel. Because what had been recorded in those ledgers, Pharaoh now believed with substantial confidence, was the movement and sale of enslaved people, not in the South, but through New England, during a period when the region's relationship to the slave trade was considerably more complicated than its later self-presentation suggested. Western Massachusetts in the mid-18th century was not a slave state, but it was not an innocent one either. The trade routes that passed through it, the networks of transport and commerce connecting coastal ports to inland towns, had been used for purposes the history books written in the 1880s by men like Edmund Lacey were not inclined to examine carefully. Reverend Obadiah Fenwick and his founding congregation had not simply been dissenters who walked inland until they found a pleasing river bend. They had been, Pharaoh believed, people with something to hide who had chosen distance and institutional authority as their protection. The dispute with the Boston congregation from which they had departed, the dispute over property held in common, and the terms of its disposition, may well have been a falling out over the term of an prize who could another prize whose nature neither party wished to commit to paper and language. It could be understood. He shared this theory with Margaret carefully, in stages, watching her face as he went. She did not disbelieve him. She had been reading the same history that he had, and she had arrived at similar conclusions by a slightly different route. The convergence of their reasoning felt to her less like confirmation than like the uncomfortable recognition of something she had been trying not to conclude. She thought about the founding families of Havelock, the names she had grown up hearing spoken with a kind of ancestral reverence, and the names on the stone monuments in the churchyard, the names of roads and landmarks. She thought about what it meant for a community's sense of itself, if the foundation beneath its oldest institution was not what it had always believed. The implications were not abstract. They were architectural. They touched everything built on top of them. The implications for Reverend Drummond were clear. He was not the originator of the secret. He had inherited it as his father had before him, as his grandfather had before that. 3 generations of Drummonds in the pulpit of St. Aldric's, each one receiving from his predecessor the knowledge of what lay beneath the building where they preached. Whether Drummond had himself used the chamber, had added to the ledgers, had continued any active form of the practice, this Pharaoh could not yet establish. But the destruction of the congregation registers for the years 1856 through 1872 had been deliberate, and it had been deliberate in a way that suggested someone had known those years' records were dangerous. In late May, Pharaoh's room at the tavern was entered while he was absent. He knew it had been entered, because he kept his materials in a particular arrangement that he checked every time he returned, and the arrangement had been disturbed. Not carelessly, not in the fashion of an ordinary burglar, but with the precision of someone who had been looking for specific things and had taken pains not to leave obvious evidence of their search, which itself told Pharaoh something important about who had arranged it. Nothing appeared to have been taken. His notebook, his most important documents, he carried with him. But he understood the message with complete clarity. He told Margaret that evening that they should both proceed carefully, and that she, in particular, should be cautious about any conversations in the schoolhouse. She asked him if he was frightened. He said he had been doing this kind of work for 20 years, and that being searched was usually a sign you were close to something. He did not say whether that was supposed to be comforting. 3 days later, a member of the church's board of trustees, a man named Harlan Tibbott, who had farmed 40 acres east of town for 30 years and attended every board meeting without fail for 15, came to the tavern and asked to speak with Pharaoh privately. They sat in a back corner of the common room, the fire burning low. Two other men at the bar talking about nothing in particular, with the deliberate absorption of people who are politely not listening. Tibbet was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked the same land for 30 years. And he held his hat in his lap and turned it slowly while he spoke. The way men hold things when they need to do something with their hands to keep the rest of themselves from moving. He said that he had come not to threaten Pharaoh, but because he was frightened and had been frightened for some time and did not know what else to do with that fear, except bring it somewhere. He said that he had known about the chamber since his appointment to the board 9 years earlier, when Drummond had told him as a matter of necessity, because the board held fiduciary responsibility for the church property and needed to understand what it included. He said he had been told that the chamber was a historical remnant, a relic of a former era, that the ledgers documented old business matters of no current relevance, and that the appropriate course was to leave it undisturbed and ensure that it remained so. He said that he had believed this, or had chosen to believe it, for 9 years. He said he was not sure he believed it anymore. He paused here. The fire cracked. One of the men at the bar said something that made the other laugh. He said that 2 nights ago Reverend Drummond had burned something in the church's wood stove, an unusual thing to do in late May, and that he, Tibbet, had been present when Drummond did it, and had seen enough of what was being burned to recognize that it was pages from one of the bound ledgers. He said he did not know how Drummond had gotten the ledgers from the chamber, or when. He said he had stood there and watched and had not said anything, because he had not known what to say, and had gone home afterward, and had not slept. Pharaoh asked him one question: how many ledgers had there been? Tibbet said he didn't know exactly. He said he had been in the chamber twice and had tried not to look too carefully. He said there had been many. He said the shelves had been full of them. Pharaoh asked if he would be willing to testify to what he had seen. Tibbet looked at the table for a long time, long enough that the silence stopped being a pause and started being an answer. And then he said he didn't know. He said he needed to think. He said he had a family. He said the words flatly without drama, as a simple statement of the thing that stood between him and what he knew was right. And Pharaoh did not press him on it, because there was nothing to press. Tibbet stood up, put on his coat, and left the tavern into the warm spring night. He did not return. He did not send word. He simply removed himself from the situation in the way that people remove themselves from situations when the cost of remaining has become too high to pay. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Havelock intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On the 14th of June, 1879, Margaret Yarrow sent a letter to a journalist she knew at the Springfield Republican, a man named Horace Belden, who had published pieces on local history and institutional accountability, and who had, in her estimation, the combination of courage and credibility that what she was about to describe would require. The letter took 11 days to produce a response, during which time she taught her classes, maintained her ordinary routines, and experienced the particular quality of fear that is not dramatic but chronic. The low, great awareness that the ground beneath you is less solid than it appeared, and that certain people who have reason to wish you quiet are aware of your existence. Pharaoh, in those same days, had made two decisions that would prove critical. The first was to write out a complete account of everything he had found, and to send it by registered post to a colleague in Boston with instructions that, if he did not write to confirm its receipt within 3 weeks, the colleague was to deliver it to the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General. The second was to attempt to gain access to the chamber directly. He had obtained, through means he never fully explained, and that Margaret had the sense not to press him on, a copy of the architectural survey the church had commissioned in 1851. A survey that contained, in its depiction of the foundation structure, something no subsequent official document had mentioned: a notation at the base of the north exterior wall, referencing a pre-existing stone passage of uncertain origin that had been incorporated into the foundation design, and whose interior terminus was recorded as a rectangular chamber of approximately 300 square feet. The notation had not been hidden. It was there in the survey, drafted by an outside surveyor who apparently did not know the significance of what he was recording, and filed with the county alongside the renovation permits. Someone had simply hoped, correctly, that no one who what they were looking at would ever think to look there. Pharaoh went to the church on the evening of June 21st, after dark. He had a lantern and the architectural survey and the address of the north exterior entry point, which the survey suggested was concealed behind the buttress of the north transept, a section of wall that had always been thickly grown with ivy and was not visible from the road. The night was warm and still, the kind of June night that makes the countryside feel inhabited by something other than the people who nominally live in it. Insects in the grass, the distant complaint of a screech owl somewhere in the tree line, the smell of the river. The church stood dark against a sky with enough moon to navigate by and enough cloud to make the shadows unreliable. Pharaoh had done things like this before, or things adjacent to it, and he knew the particular discipline it required to move slowly, to breathe steadily, to understand that the sounds your imagination generates in the dark are louder than the sounds actually present, and to keep them distinct. He found the entry point after approximately 30 minutes of searching the ivy. Covered buttress by hand, his lantern shuddered down to its minimum, feeling along the stone for a change in texture. The door, when he located it, was smaller than he had expected, perhaps 5 feet high, requiring a pronounced stoop to enter, and made of planks that had been treated with something that had preserved them from rot despite their age. Its hinges had been recently oiled, which was the detail that told him most clearly that this entrance was still being used. Recently, by someone with a key and a reason. Inside, the passage ran approximately 40 feet before opening into the chamber. On the floor of the passage was packed earth, the ceiling stone, and the air in it was cooler than the night outside in a way that deepened as he moved forward. The thermal signature of a space far underground that had been sealed from the season's changes for a very long time. He could smell the chamber before he reached it. That combination of old paper and tallow and compressed air that Elias Croft had tried and failed to adequately describe, and that Pharaoh found he also could not quite name in any satisfying way. It was not unpleasant precisely. It was the smell of deliberate preservation, of things kept from the light with intention. The chamber was not as Elias Croft or Jonathan Peele had described it. That is to say, the room was the same. The dimensions, the stone walls, the low ceiling, the fitted fieldstone construction that predated the church above it. But the shelves were different. In the months since Croft's discovery and the subsequent sealing of the site, Someone had been coming here. Many of the ledgers were gone. Others remained, the ones that appeared on quick examination to be the oldest and most deteriorated. Perhaps the ones deemed least intelligible or least dangerous, or perhaps simply the ones that the person systematically removing the archive had not yet gotten to, or had decided were not worth the risk of carrying out. The wooden chest was still present, its lock intact. Pharaoh noted that the brass lock appeared newer than the chest itself, recently replaced or fitted to a chest that had originally held something less secured. And on the floor in the center of the chamber were the ashes of burned paper, not from the wood stove Tibbet had seen Drummond use, but from burning done here in the chamber itself, on the stone floor, in a pile large enough to have required several visits and several hours of work. He crouched beside the ash pile and examined it with his lantern. At the edges of the pile, where the burning had been less complete, there were fragments, pieces of paper that had curled and charred without consuming entirely. He could make out portions of handwriting, portions of numbers, what appeared to be a partial name here and there, but nothing coherent enough to constitute evidence, in any meaningful sense. Someone had been thorough. Someone had been coming here with fire and patience, and the understanding that thoroughness matters. Someone had been systematically destroying the archive. Pharaoh examined what remained on the shelves. He could not open the locked chest without tools he did not have, and the time available to him was limited. He was acutely aware that being discovered here would expose him to legal consequences that Drummond's allies on the town board of selectmen could arrange without difficulty. He opened the ledgers that remained, the deteriorated ones, working carefully with a small knife to separate pages that had stuck together with age and humidity. What he found confirmed what he had theorized, but it also exceeded it in ways he had not anticipated. The earliest entries he could find dated to 1743, 2 years after the church's consecration. The goods referenced were not goods. The movement of people through the town, documented in careful handwriting by men who had stood at this pulpit and called themselves servants of God, corresponded to periods of documented in the colonial trade. Activity that the region's was discussed in carefully explicit language, did not name what it was. But interspersed among the transaction records were other entries, different in character, different in handwriting, different in the kind of attention they represented. These were not commercial records. They were something closer to a journal. Brief, compressed, written in a style that suggested the author was aware that directness was dangerous and had developed a habit of oblique notation that was nevertheless to a careful reader clear enough. These entries describe people, not as transactions, but as people. Names in some cases, and places of origin, ages estimated. Physical descriptions written in the careful neutral language of someone trying to document without personalizing. And in certain entries, notes about what had happened to them, where they had been sent in some cases, or in other cases, simply the notation of a date and an absence, which in context could mean several things, none of them good. Pharaoh sat in the chamber for a long time with those pages. He was not a sentimental man, and he had been a journalist long enough to have developed some insulation against the weight of the things he covered. But this was different in a way that the insulation did not fully address. He was sitting in a room that had been used for over 100 years by men who prayed on Sundays and maintained accounts on other days, who had looked at other human beings and had written them into ledgers, who had sat in this exact space with candles burning and found the thing they were doing administrative rather than monstrous. He thought about the accumulated weight of all those candles, the wax strata on the pewter base that Croft had described, each layer representing a visit, each visit representing a decision to continue. Each decision made by a man who had walked up the stairs of his church the following morning and opened his mouth and said things about the love of God. He gathered what he had, the few pages he had been able to carefully, separate from the most legible remaining ledger, and went out through the exterior door, pulling it closed behind him and pressing himself against the ivy in the dark of the buttress. He heard footsteps above him, not on the exterior path, but from inside the church. Someone was in the nave moving toward the interior passage entrance. The footsteps were measured, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had walked this path many times. Pharaoh pressed himself flat against the stone and did not breathe. The ivy smelled of dampness and old growth. A light appeared at a gap in the stonework, a lantern carried by someone moving through the interior passage. The light moved and stopped and moved again, and then was still. He waited. The night around him was full of small sounds that his body was translating as threats. He stood there for a very long time, until the light was gone and the footsteps had retreated, and the church was dark again. When he finally moved, he moved quickly, and he did not stop until he was back at the tavern with his door locked and his chair pushed against it. He wrote through the night. In the morning, he sent the pages to Boston with a letter explaining their significance. That same morning, he went to find Margaret Yarrow and told her that the time for patience was over. The question was no longer what had happened beneath St. Aldric's church. That question had been substantially answered. The question now was whether the community above it, the town that had been built on the income, the respectability, the institutional authority that the men who used that chamber had accumulated, would be willing to look at what the answer meant for everything they believed about themselves. And if they were not willing, what would happen to the people who insisted on looking anyway? Reverend Silas Drummond preached that Sunday on the subject of forgiveness, specifically, the importance of extending forgiveness to those who had committed wrongs in ignorance, and the equal importance of not compelling people to examine past sins that time had rendered irresolvable. It was a carefully constructed sermon. Those members of the congregation who were paying attention noticed that it made a sustained distinction between sins that were historical, committed by people now dead, in circumstances now gone, by a moral framework now superseded, and sins that were current, which were a different matter entirely and deserved a different response. The implication being that what lay beneath the church, if it was what certain people were beginning to suggest it was, belonged to the former category and should be treated accordingly. Several members of the congregation found the sermon peculiarly specific. Several others found it consoling. Harlan Tibbet was not present. His pew was empty for the first time in 15 years. And no one in the church commented on this, which was itself a kind of comment. The Springfield Republican published Horace Belden's piece in August of 1879. It ran across 4 columns and was careful. Belden was a careful writer, and he was also a practical one who understood what a New England newspaper could and could not say about a still, functioning institution with lawyers and community standing. The piece did not name Drummond directly. It described the discovery of a sealed foundation chamber beneath a Havelock church and the apparent destruction of historical records that the chamber had contained, and the questions raised by documentary evidence suggesting the chamber had been used for purposes inconsistent with the institution's stated mission. It quoted 2 sources who were not named. It noted that attempts to speak with church officials had been declined. The piece was reprinted in 2 other Massachusetts papers and 1 in Connecticut. It generated correspondence. Letters to the editors, to the Regional Conference of Congregational Churches, to the Selectmen of Havelock. Some of the letters were outraged on behalf of the church. Some were outraged on behalf of the community. The Regional Conference sent a representative to Havelock in September, a young pastor from Worcester, who met with Drummond privately for 2 hours and afterward released a statement saying that the matter was under review and that the congregation should be for the transparency and accountability, which in the language of institutional self-protection meant very nearly the worst old Reverend Silas Drummond resigned his position in October 1879, citing poor health. He was 64 years old and had never previously given any indication of health problems. He moved to a house in western Connecticut, where he lived quietly for another 11 years before dying in 1890. No charges were ever filed against him. The county records of his tenure show a gap in the midsection that was officially attributed to a filing error during an office reorganization. Cornelius Vane retired from the deaconate in the same month, also citing health. He remained in Havelock and continued to operate his dry goods store for several more years. He never spoke publicly about any of it, which had always been one of his most consistent qualities. The wooden chest in the chamber was eventually removed by order of the Regional Conference representative. Its contents were never publicly disclosed. A church record from 1882. Part of an attempt to reconstruct what had been destroyed. Contains a single line noting that certain historical materials had been received from an auxiliary storage space and transferred to the conference archive for safekeeping. The conference archive, when queried in subsequent years by historians, consistently reported that materials from this period were incomplete or unavailable. Harlan Tibbet left Havelock in 1880. He sold his farm to a family from Vermont and relocated to the Ohio Territory. He gave one interview to a local Ohio paper in 1887 in which he described his origins only as a small Massachusetts town and declined to be more specific. He said he left because the place had changed. And then he said that wasn't quite right. That the place had not changed, that he had, and that the difference between those two things was the entire matter. Margaret Yarrow continued to teach at the Havelock School for 4 more years before accepting a position at a girls' academy in Northampton, where she taught for the rest of her working life. She kept the letter from the Boston archivist, the one with the handwritten addition at the bottom, in a wooden box with other documents she considered significant. After her death in 1921, her papers were donated to the Northampton Public Library, where they sat in an uncatalogued collection for many years. A graduate student working on a thesis about antebellum commerce in western Massachusetts found them in 1967. The thesis chapter drawing on Margaret's documents was removed from the final version at the recommendation of the student's faculty advisor, who felt the claims required more substantiation than the available primary sources could provide. The documents themselves remain in the collection, available to anyone who asks for the Yarrow papers, though very few people do. Augustine Farrow published the most detailed account of his Havelock investigation, including the pages he had removed from the chamber, in a small Boston periodical in 1881. The piece generated less response than Belden's more cautious version, partly because the periodical had a small circulation, and partly because 1881 was a year in which the country had other things to attend to. He submitted an expanded version to 2 larger publications, both of which declined it. He continued working as a journalist for another decade, primarily on topics unrelated to New England church history. He died in 1903. His papers were not donated anywhere. St. Aldric's church continued operating under new leadership following Drummond's departure. The chamber beneath the north plot was filled with concrete in the spring of 1880 as part of what was described as a foundation stabilization project. The exterior door in the buttress was bricked over and the ivy allowed to grow back. By 1885, you would not have known it was there. By 1900, no one in Havelock under the age of 30 had any knowledge that the matter had occurred at all. The church was repainted that year. A new white coat applied to the clapboard siding by volunteers. And on the Sunday of the rededication, the new reverend delivered a sermon about foundations, the importance of building on solid ground, of knowing what lies beneath you, of carrying forward into the present the faith that those before us established and entrusted to our care. The congregation found it very moving. Several people said it was the best sermon they had heard in years. Elias Croft was never located. No further correspondence from him was found by his former landlady. What he saw at the bottom of those 12 granite steps, the part of it he did not describe, the thing that lived in the silence between what he said and what he would not say, remained his alone. There are questions that get buried not because the answers are lost, but because enough people, in enough positions of enough authority decide, across enough generations, that the cost of knowing is higher than the cost of not knowing. And communities, like foundations, can be built on those decisions. They can stand on them for a very long time. And they can look from the outside perfectly solid. The Latin carved into the underside of the granite slab, Nemo Siet, was destroyed when the chamber was filled. We know it was there because Elias Croft told exactly one person, and that person told exactly one other person, and so on, down the long corridor of whispered things that survive only because some fragment of human conscience keeps insisting, against all practical interest, that someone ought to know. This mystery shows us something the history books rarely say plainly, that the most durable secrets are not the ones that no one discovers, but the ones that communities decide, together, to stop looking at. The staircase beneath St. Aldric's was not hidden from everyone. It was hidden by everyone who had enough to lose by its existence being known. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think the most important ledger was the one that never made it out of that chamber? Leave your comment below. And if you want more stories like this, stories that make you question what's buried under the places we call sacred, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear.